Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's ZenTalk. This is the third in a series on analytics governance, and we're excited today to be able to present real-world examples of different approaches that organizations are taking in their analytics governance journey. And so we have a lot of content today to cover, and I don't want to cut anything short or rush. But as a reminder, our featured guests today are both thought leaders in the industry. Donald Farmer is an advisor and consultant in data strategy and governance and compliance. He has workshops on innovation strategy and is a well-known, renowned thought leader around the world. So we're grateful to have him for this series. Thank you, Donald. And Hina is our internal ZenOptics thought leader for today's session. And she has a wealth of experience both in industry, but also as CTO and co-founder at ZenOptics. And she works closely with all of our customers as they're on their journey in various different elements. But she's the one who's going to present these mini case studies for today. And Donald will chime in with his industry perspective, the broader view. As a quick reminder, this whole series has been great. We started off with assessing maturity for analytics governance. We then went into, okay, so what do you do to advance your maturity and advance analytics governance within your organization? And today, we're excited to share the examples and the different approaches. And there are indeed different approaches. And so I guess, Donald, if we can start with handing it over to you, and can you talk about why different organizations might take different approaches and what that could look like?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Different approaches. One of the things we spoke about in our first webinar was the maturity of an organization. And so different approaches to governance will actually often be determined by the maturity of the organization and the maturity of its market. So a good example of that would be a large enterprise, like a large pharmaceutical company working in a field which is highly regulated. Their approach to analytics governance needs to be very prescriptive. There are certain things they just absolutely must do, they must get right, they must conform to. On the other hand, the startup or a small company, or even if it's a medium enterprise, working in an experimental field where there are no standardized kind of formats and there are no standardized procedures, patterns, or practices, is going to have a different approach to analytics governance, because their approach will be around how do they actually function better as a company, rather than how am I compliant with all these rules and regulations which are constraining me. And so as you develop as a company, as you mature as a company, you shift the focus of your governance from how do I run my company better to how do I run my company better, but also in conformance with a set of rules and regulations. And along the way, there's an infinite spectrum of capabilities and possibilities along the way. But that becomes one of the primary differentiators. What am I trying to achieve with governance? Am I just trying to achieve making better decisions? Am I trying to achieve making those decisions perhaps in a more agile, but a more confident way, right up to the point where I have to say, yes, I want to make confident, agile decisions, but I also have to make them with a sense of compliance with internal, external, federal, national, local rules, and that becomes another kind of priority for you. How does that sound? Does that sound, when I think about the examples that you're going to talk about, most of our people that we talk about are probably at the higher end of that problem. But I think that's where the rubber really hits the road in terms of governance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think recognizing the fact that you have to approach it differently is the starting point, right? Because there is no one size fits all, or just because there are different nuances to what you're going to govern to begin with, and how you're going to sort of put that process in place, because the word governance, we all know, is quite a heavy word. And so I guess with that, I can jump into the first use case where, the analytics governance is really driven off of the sort of, I guess, acknowledgement of the fact that having a KPI and an analytics command center is central to being able to drive the information delivery and consumption, right? So if you think about it, the approach in this particular use case is that you're really starting off with the key measures and the key performance indicators that are being measured, as well as the analytics assets that support those KPIs. And those are easily available, they're curated, they're defined, they're accessible, from a consumption perspective. And so much so that they're really presented in this personalized dashboard format. So they're really leading you to a effective and I guess a more confident decision-making process. Some of the key considerations for this approach is where organizations really need to ask themselves which KPIs are really relevant and important. And each KPI is specific or relevant to a particular target audience or a user group. So having that correlation and building that dependency is important so that you can then look at how to set up the analytics assets to support that entire process. And then you can talk about, the governance or the certification of those analytics and the KPIs themselves. So this is really an approach that helps you sort of manage top down. From a leadership and an executive perspective, it's one of the most effective ways that we've seen customers really start out or sort of, I guess, embark on the analytics governance journey, because they're starting from that executive perspective and the leadership perspective saying we are a KPI and an analytics-driven company, and we're building this command center.
I think that's great. And if I could just say that I think that's a really good example of using analytics governance as a way of running your company better. Yeah. It's not about necessarily being compliant at all. It's about how do we, our KPIs are about our performance, not about compliance. So this is very much focused on the performance of the company and the ability to run better.
Correct. Now, the next use case there is sort of building on that command center. And this is where some amount of the compliance could come in, where you're really establishing linkages between relevant assets. And you're making sure that, this is what we call the concept of stewardship and governing the process or the stages for certification. So while the command center is enabling you to really identify and say that these are my KPIs, these are my reports, you're now going one level beyond that and you're certifying it through a governance and a stewardship process, which is a workflow-oriented governance process where you're able to now establish your enterprise certified KPIs and analytics versus your business certified analytics that support those KPIs, and you're able to bring in relationships to that to content that supports that. So I would say this is definitely more oriented and leading towards you being able to establish that governance workflow in context of maybe more of a compliance model where you're really calling out who's the technical reviewer, who's the business reviewer, how has this KPI been monitored or reviewed? Is it really meeting the definition that, the purpose that it's meant? Is the definition, meeting the purpose that it was meant to be for?
And Hina, can I just ask a question here? You said enterprise certified versus business certified analytics. Can you just elaborate on the difference between those two, the way that this use case is looking at it?
Absolutely. It's if you think about it right now, there's certain reports, and this falls under the category of report governance, right? And there are certain analytics assets that enable a business decision or a business unit sort of decision-making process and a function. However, there are the enterprise certified reports, right? Those are at the enterprise level. Those are your sort of your golden truth and your single source of truth reports that are running your business, right? And helping you manage. So it's sort of if you think about it, it's layered governance in the sense that you're starting out with your enterprise certified reports that are then leading into your business certified, and the ability to link these, right, through the concept of what we call related reports really brings the two pieces together very nicely, because now you can say that, okay, here's my enterprise certified reports, and these depend on these business certified reports, right? Or it could also depend on other related reports. So hopefully that helps explain it. It's more departmental or business function focused versus more at the enterprise level.
Yes, thank you. That makes sense.
One thing I think
Donald,
is very important.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I think is very important here is that we're starting to, going to move on now on to the point that governance is not just about kind of individual points of control. It's actually a workflow. There's a
Yeah.
process to governance, and
Yes.
that process involves, many artifacts which are linked, many processes which are linked, and very importantly, the idea that there is a workflow that has to be governed. You can't just say, well, I've got this KPI and it's fine, therefore I'm well governed. There has to be a process behind that as well. And I think this is because governance is, what we're doing is we're ensuring that decisions are made in the right way. It's not just that we're making the right decision, but that we're following the right process in making that decision. So governance is an oversight of a process, and therefore
Mhm.
governance itself must be a process.
And what I love about this is that it might be a slightly different process at the enterprise level than it is within a business unit, and yet you need the standardization of both and to be able to correlate the processes between the two in order to have that consistent decision-making process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. All right, so then we move on to more of a report optimization and rationalization use case where you're starting out with a problem, which is that, there's too many assets and you don't know what exists, or you know what exists, but there's tons of duplication, redundancy, and non-use, or you're just not using these assets. And so you're sort of looking at very high costs for maintenance, both from a people perspective as well as obviously a technology and a storage and a maintenance of just the systems, right? And these reports themselves, because you've got to keep updating them when you change your underlying data sources and your data warehouses. You've got to make sure that everything still continues to work, whether or not it's being used. So there's a cost to it. So a lot of the sort of a way of approaching governance is to say, let's rationalize the environment upfront for a more targeted user experience, and then establish the process for an ongoing report lifecycle management. We sort of codename this as ROAR, Report Optimization and Rationalization Framework, because there is definitely a big roar around it in terms of the cleanup involved, right? And making sure that everyone's on board and understands the value, but really it helps establish that starting point, right? And so you're not really bringing in everything that exists. You're starting to do the assessment by bringing it into the staging layer, right? And sort of bringing visibility to it, but then saying, I'm going to manage what I really promote for consumption. Is that, I know it's a slightly different sort of variation. And so any comments, Donald, on this?
I've got lots of comments. It's a very important variation, and I like the ROAR. I like the ROAR acronym. I think it's great because actually people are very attached to their reports, and departments get very attached to the reports. And when I've worked in self-service business intelligence for many years, it's been one of the kind of one of the key fields in which I think I've made any kind of contribution in the industry has been developing tools for self-service BI. The problem is I'm actually part of the problem. I've created these tools which enable people every time they want a report. Some of the tools, it's actually easier to build a new report than it is to dig into your enterprise repositories and find the right report. I'll just create the right report. It's easier to do it in easier to create a report in Power BI than it is to find a report in Power BI, and therefore you end up in this mess of just a proliferation of reports. And of course, the more that happens, the more it becomes true. The more it becomes easier to find out, and it really does need somebody to step in and say, no, we can rationalize this. But how do you rationalize it? The old way is switch off the server and see who complains is not exactly efficient. So you have to dig into this and find a systematic way and of course an automated way of having visibility into what's actually going on, having visibility into what exists, what's being used. And very often, what is certified by IT may not be the report that's being used most, because it turns out that it's out of date or it's not updated with the latest kind of cool stuff. And so people are using other reports. So you have to find out what exists. You have to find out what's popular, which is almost like a kind of social media thing. And you have to find out, what's most appropriate, in the sense that, what is best built, what is most accurate, what is connected to the right data sources at the back end. All of that then enables you to do the deduplication, to discover the redundancies, to discover the reports which are unused, but also to discover the reports which actually are popular, understand what's good about them, and then promote them to people. That's actually really important as well. If people don't know the report is there, they either have to be very motivated to go looking for it, or do what ZenOptics can do, which is say, here are the reports you should be looking at. Here are the reports which are most used. Here are the reports which are validated. Here are the reports which are related to the ones you're already using. So, this is what you should be looking at. I think that process is, and I do kind of compare it to like a Netflix engine, or a Netflix recommendation engine, or an Amazon engine in some way. Like, here is what you should be looking for. Here's what you should be using. I think is very is a great contribution to reducing the craziness of enterprise reporting.
And I want to add that many people think of this as an initial cleanup effort and think of it as, okay, we've embarked on this and okay, we've reached our targets, but it has to be an ongoing process or else you'll end up back where you started. You need to, organizations need to establish continual management and maintenance of the environment and make sure that the reports aren't proliferating, that there aren't, offshoots of reports that are being created by individuals. So yes, promoting the right content is important so that individuals know what's there, but also communicating how, if they need something different, if they, you don't have to create a new report every single time. So it is an ongoing process. It's not just a once and done.
Yep.
I think that's I think that's absolutely vital. Actually, that this is not something. I mean, you can do an initial cleanup, but that doesn't. But if people are continually self-serving themselves, to reports and dashboards, that's not really helping. It needs this continuous process.
Well, and I want to emphasize that self-service isn't a bad thing. That yes, it's a challenge, and it comes with inherent challenges. But we do want people. Obviously, the point is to enable people to have the information and the resources, the assets of reports and dashboards at their fingertips, and be able to feel like they can accomplish what they need to on their own. And so, we give self-service a bad rap sometimes, but in and of itself, it's not bad. It's just, it needs a set of processes around it for making sure that the right assets exist and are used for decision making.
Well, that's absolutely fair. And the contribution of ZenOptics here is actually very important, because it tells you where the gaps are. It doesn't just tell you what already exists. It also means you can confidently identify what doesn't exist. And therefore, I do need a new report. I do need a new dashboard. And therefore, I can create it myself with the confidence that I'm not creating redundancy. So it does add more confidence to the self-service process. So in many ways, it's not a constraint on self-service. It's actually an enabler for, if you like, the proper, responsible use of self-service. And I think that's an important aspect of it.
Well, you both are hitting on exactly the next use case. So
always a good one.
So this is all about governing self-service analytics creation and use, right? And the way we do this is by providing a decentralized stewardship model that helps drive the governance at the organizational level, but establishes that individual accountability. So we were talking about, think of it as the guardrails, right, that we're providing on the self-service analytics. And self-service is very important. There's a lot of value, but and it evolved as a result of everyone wanting to adopt best of breed, right? So we're sort of enabling that model where we become a centralized report catalog, right? Where we're enabling these report producers or these analytics producers to really come in and promote the content from these distributed content creation channels and activities. However, we're providing them the ability to really manage that content through the various, metadata aspects. You can, certify a report. You can define who owns that report. You can add additional description to that report. So you're now making sure that as new reports are being created, there is real accountability and ownership to that content, and that someone really can think that, okay, before I go create something, let me go check and make sure that it doesn't already exist. And that comes as a result of what we talked about in the previous slide is if you've already done that curation and then you're maintaining an ongoing life cycle around it, you're actually enabling those report and business owners to now have an active role in the stewardship of the content. So it's not just about content creation anymore. It's about really managing, governing, and being stewards and owners. Because the biggest problem one of the biggest problems we've seen is, there's tons of content out there, tons of assets, but no one knows who owns them. No one knows what they're for. No one knows the description. And that's where the swarm starts to happen. But now you're sort of putting the responsibility and accountability in the hands of people who really are the champions for self-service, the people that use self-service. Well, here's now a way for you to really, govern that process. So both of you were like spot on in terms of leading into this.
And Hina,
well, that's good.
No, go ahead, Donald, please.
Well, I was going to say that there is a tendency now in data analytics world, business intelligence world to a certain extent, but especially in data analytics, for decentralization. People are increasingly decentralizing. So technologies like data mesh or architectures like data mesh and data fabric are encouraging people to, to decentralize. And their concern with governance has always been, well, that re-centralizes everything. And I think having the very idea of a decentralized approach to governance, as a decentralized approach to stewardship, is actually quite a breakthrough. A few years ago, you'd have thought that the very opposite was necessary. You could only be a data steward and only be an analytics steward if you centralized everything under a single point of control. But actually enabling not only a decentralized architecture, but also a decentralized stewardship process is, I think, is a great contribution to what I would call the kind of the modern pattern of analytics, which is itself very decentralized.
And thank you, Donald, for saying that, because that set the stage for what actually I was going to say. And specifically with the customers that we see with this decentralized stewardship model, a lot of that happens because the different business units or different groups within the larger enterprise, they're the subject matter experts about the content that they're publishing and promoting for their business users. And so often to have a single centralized governance model, although we're centralizing the reports and centralizing the visibility of those analytic assets in the organization, it for some organizations makes sense to provide the additional stewardship at different levels so that then they can manage their own assets in a way that they know will best meet their people's needs. So whether that's creation or whether that's publishing and promoting those assets for use, and then how they roll up throughout the organization and sharing them and such. But people know their information best within their own business unit, and so allowing them to keep that and yet also live within the framework and the guardrails of the overarching process is huge.
Absolutely. All right. So I think that covers, a set of core use cases that revolve around, analytics governance as we see them in the real world and in our implementations of how the platform is used, and some of those platform capabilities that enable these use cases is around, the first two that we talked about, or I guess the first two use cases primarily revolve around the use of our BI glossary and dictionary that helps manage the KPIs, helps curate those KPIs, certify those KPIs, and their relevant analytics. The report governance and stewardship is sort of on top of that, which brings in that workflow for the governance process and allows you to really take these analytics through these different governance models and define the governance around each one of the whether it's enterprise or business certified, it really helps you establish what the workflow looks like, ultimately leading to the certification of those reports and metadata, which again, like I said, is either it's certified or not, or it's got the multi-tiered certification model. And then obviously the metadata around usage and information about the assets is what drives that whole rationalization and optimization. So we were talking, Donald, you were talking about how the technology enables an automated process to do this, right? And that's what we do, is we We bring all this metadata together, metadata that we inherit, right, from the source systems, metadata that we enhance, and the usage patterns and the usage information to be able to sort of bring all of that together and drive that whole rationalization framework. So these are sort of some of the key platform capabilities that facilitate the implementation of the governance process, and they empower the practice ultimately of decision making.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
think
With
this
that-
is great. It's very comprehensive.
Thank you.
And so, Hina, I know we've talked about different use cases here. We've talked about platform capabilities that support those use cases. I would love for us, as we are wrapping up this series on analytics governance, we've covered a ton of content about what maturity looks like and different routes that organizations can take and why, and what are the drivers for analytics governance. Are there any final thoughts that you just want to reiterate or that you want to emphasize that are takeaways for the audience as we wrap up the series?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to also hear from Donald, obviously, but based on my day-to-day experience, as well as everything that's going on around, just the state of the world, the economy, and the industry, this is a now and, must-have sort of situation and a problem to address. It's no longer a nice to have, right? It's about making sure that you're set up for success for the future in terms of establishing that platform and or process, and both, right? Actually both, to enable you to really leverage the investments and get the most ROI out of what you've already built. So bringing visibility, it's almost like, your lens into your success in managing the organization. And so I look at it as, a need of the hour, a must-have, and something that all leaders should be thinking about for 2024. And with that, I'll hand it over to Donald, because I'd love to hear his thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think this has been a really interesting series to take part in, and I've learned a great deal, especially about the practical application of some of these ideas. I think two things I would take away from what we've been talking about. The first is, the importance of this. It's absolutely essential to have to govern analytics. We used to talk so much about governing data, and yet data is just the raw material. What you do with the data is analytics primarily. Mm-hmm. And if you're not governing that, then you're only governing half the process. The idea that you govern your data and then everything downstream is good is very unrealistic. So you must govern your analytics for all the reasons that we've covered in the use cases today. But that's the other point, which is that there's not just one way of doing this, and there's not just one pattern. It's not as if you say there's this rigid model of governance which everyone must follow. Synoptics in particular has rich enough tool set that you can govern your analytics in ways which are most appropriate for the maturity as an organization and for your organizational style, your organizational culture, what will work for you, from the most prescriptive forms of governance and compliance to the very kind of business performance focus of optimization and efficiency. And so I think the kind of takeaways for me is that this is an essential practice that CIOs, CTOs, analytics officers should absolutely be following if they are to make the best of their business. And it's also a very flexible practice. It's not prescriptive. There's a lot of value to it. So I would hope that people would come away from this series with a sort of sense of a certain sense of excitement about this. Governance is an enabling function. It's not a constraining function. It enables you to do more with more confidence. And my goodness, that's something we all need going into 2024.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well said. Yes.
Exactly. Well said. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both for all of your insights that you've shared throughout this series, and I have loved these conversations. I've loved preparing for them. I've loved being able to share them with our audience. Donald, as our special guest, thank you so much for joining us for these. Thank you to our audience for not just today's session, but all of them. Please visit our website to look at not just this series, but our other Zen Talks that we've also published, and we will be promoting a new series coming up in the coming weeks. So keep visiting zenoptics.com. If you have any questions or anything, my email address is juliel@zenoptics.com. Please feel free to reach out. We would love to talk to you in person. And with that, I will thank everyone and wish you a good day and a happy 2024.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.